Hi, everyone. This is Jackson Steger, and you're listening to Campfire, a new limited series podcast from Cabin. Campfire is a show that seeks to understand how decentralized organizations achieve wildly ambitious and creative goals. Each week, we are joined by different DAO leaders and operators who share the tips, tricks, and tactics that they have used to build community and ship product. Today's guests are Flex and Commodore, two of the founders of Krause House, a community of basketball fans co-organizing to purchase and operate an NBA team. Crypto has fueled huge crowdfunds before. Constitution DAO inspired thousands of people to raise $48 million last fall to try to buy a copy of the US Constitution. This past month, crypto holders donated more than $52 million to Ukraine in the first week of Russia's invasion. Krause House would have to raise significantly more than this. The last NBA team to be sold was the Brooklyn Nets in 2019 for about $3.3 billion. But this collective of hoop fanatics also intends to assume control of many day-to-day operations of the team, which would be unprecedented for any modern sports league. Flex and Commodore, who are both pseudonymously leading the DAO, joined the show to share their game plan and lay out why executing Krause House's vision is so worthwhile. I asked them about other models for fan ownership, how they intend to build credibility with the NBA, which parts of running a team are appropriate for decentralized delegation, and much, much more. Campfire is produced by Cabin, which is a DAO building a decentralized city for independent online creators. All right, it's tip-off time. Hope you enjoy this episode. I am sitting here with Flex and Commodore. The day is February 11th. We are here one day after the NBA trade deadline. I am rocking a Sixers shirt and am glad to trust the process along with Flex and Commodore. We're just going to hop right into it. So Jerry Krause, for whom your DAO was named after, was the GM of the Bulls during the Michael Jordan era. And he famously offended Michael after Jerry was quoted saying that players don't win championships, organizations do. We'll get to the how, but I want to start with the why behind Krause House. Why is it a good idea for fans to have an ownership stake in a team?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sports fans are kind of irrationally passionate, right? When you think about it objectively, there's no reason why we should love our teams as much as we do. The impact on our life is very nominal based on the seasons, the outcome of the season, I should say. But we just care so much. It's about identifying with something that is bigger than you. So typically that city that you're born and raised in, or a city that you spent most of your time. And there's kind of this innate community that is baked into fandom that I think that people really resonate with. And when we think about fans, typically we think about them as almost these fungible assets, right? There's just people in the stadium that are all wearing a similar jersey. But when you actually think about it, right, these are lawyers, there's doctors, they're entrepreneurs, there's a wide variety of skills and skill sets that are basically, if you think about it, kind of underutilized in a sense. So Commodore and I kind of have this vision where we think that fans who have already dedicated so much of their emotional life towards their team that they support, that I think that one day we kind of envision this world where there would be some shared upside and reciprocity in that. And I think that what we've seen, the technological progression that we've seen in Web3 is just now allowing for that. So why should fans own a team? I think traditionally it's kind of been unheard of. You think about the wisdom of the crowd. I think one of the coach famously said, if you listen to the fans, you'll end up sitting with them. We think that that's not necessarily true. There's a lot of value that a really smart people from all over the world could add back into a franchise simply by being owners. So there's a social advantage, there's a value advantage, there's several different ways we think that communities, particularly the fans, could help out the franchise. And so that's really what we're trying to do at Krause House. We're trying to prove that not only is it possible, but it can actually add a lot of benefit to a franchise for letting fans be involved.
I love that quote, by the way, of the owner saying you'll sit with the fans. Good, because the fans should be the owners. I think this ability of us utilizing the crowd to actually have success with a team is really powerful. And when we think about the actual asset, the Green Bay Packers are a great example, I think, that have tapped into this emotionally. They've struggled, I think, with what that actually looks like in the modern era, but in the beginning of their franchise, the people locally own the team. And that, to me, is the best connection back. Like having a billionaire who's from California come and buy the Green Bay Packers and, sort of be this benevolent dictator and try to win a championship for his own pockets and for the people, to me actually just seems like a detour of sort of capitalism that we're navigating through. So to me, these entities that are this local fan base should be owned by the local community. And I think that there's decentralized advantages to owning and then operating that with that community as well.
Awesome. It's a great place to start. I'm going to come back to some of the things you said, but first I want to navigate a little bit into the how. So for listeners, and I'll have mentioned this in our intro, but I recommend reading the flight paper that you have on your Mirror publication, which listeners will remember from last episode is a Web3 publishing platform, not unlike Mirror. So with something as ambitious and almost like crazy as Krause House mission and buying an NBA team, no one really expects you to be so successful overnight. This is a long-term project, at least a few years, maybe more. And so at the broadest level, what are the phases that you two think about when you're implementing the DAO's vision, and what are the big steps that you think of?
For us, we've really outlined a 3-phase approach. The first phase is building out a talented community. The second phase is building out credibility. We know if we snap our fingers and have $3 billion in the treasury, the NBA is not going to say yes to this entity idea. And then the third is raising the capital. So that second one is by far the most sort of interesting, because building credibility takes you through a bunch of different paths. And so for us, that's around predominantly, can we buy a minority position in a major league, or can we buy majority positions in minor or sort of international leagues? And I think there's advantages to having success in either of those, because in being as a minority owner, let's say in the NBA on the cap table, just getting a DAO as a legal entity to sit on that and the NBA to feel comfortable with that is an accomplishment. But that sort of checks a legal box. That doesn't necessarily check an operational box. And so we're really interested in, can we take majority stakes in some of these teams around the world that are more excited about experimenting with what decentralized operations look like. So then when we do this over a series of years, we hopefully look back and have a portfolio of success to say, here's the legal entity for us to interact with. Here's sort of the operational and the governance structure that we use with the broader community. And here's how to think about sort of the financial and some of the upside and equity, and how to think about the optionality there. And we feel like those kind of 3 main buckets, being able to bring that as a portfolio to the NBA is really the only way of getting a yes from that ownership group. The good news is we've got a lot in back channel of the major American sports, the NBA is by far the most open-minded to doing something like this. That's not to say it's going to be easy or that it's going to happen right away, but we're really entering that phase 2 of how do we build out credibility across a bunch of different experimentation.
Yeah, we kind of typically look at this as kind of wanting the opportunity to prove ourselves. I think in the shorter term, getting on the cap table for a smaller position allows us to really leverage the skills in our community and kind of put money where our mouth is and say, like, hey, we have this untapped pool of talent. We have developers, we have data scientists, we have marketers, we have designers that would gladly pump a value back into your franchise with whatever capacity that you see fit. And then hopefully, as we start to do that, we start to prove ourselves, then we kind of do this progressive decentralization, and kind of some of those operational or governance mechanics can be lobbed over to us. And so we are not expecting, I think when people first read the headline, they're thinking kind of this Wall Street bets YOLO mentality that we're going to come in and fire coaches and draft players. That's really not what we're up to. We love and respect the NBA, and I think that they've done a kind of a great job as an association to really grow the brand, first domestically and then internationally. So it's really about getting in front of them and showing what the possibilities are. And we don't think the entire front office needs to be decentralized, but there's certainly aspects of these franchises and organizations where decentralization or community-centric design could actually supplement these operations pretty well. We actually have an internal team called DSO, or Decentralized Sports Operations, right now that is essentially kind of this R&D skunkworks group that is talking to a lot of people within the front office and trying to figure out, what is some like low risk, high impact initiatives that we could do at the Krause House in order to add that value back into the organization. So again, we kind of look at this as kind of a phased roadmap approach, and there's a variety of different ways to prove legitimacy. And so we're kind of investigating what those things are right now and how we can be helpful.
Yeah, so the decentralized sports operation is a great example. I'm curious to learn a little bit more about what you think is in scope for the DAO to handle once you have either a minority or a majority stake in a team versus what is out of scope. Like I think of the Sixers, for example, where the whole season so far, every fan has been begging and begging the Sixers to trade Ben Simmons, and Daryl Morey, the general manager, had this sort of strong push to wait, and he probably waited more than most of the fans would have preferred. And so how do you think about like trading or drafting, like which kinds of decisions are in scope for a DAO to help take over versus which functions of owning and operating an NBA team would you want to have more centralized traditional leadership for?
It's funny when you think about general management, right? I think that's typically where people's mind goes to first when you talk about owning a team, right? How cool would that be to draft players, hire coaches, trade? That is probably one of those things that comes further down the road, especially when you kind of talking to these people that are in the front office and you start to realize how much of it is built on relationships and connections. It would be really hard to decentralize that, especially in the beginning. And so one thing that's kind of worth noting is what we've heard from some of the owners is that they actually, despite even some of the majority owners, they actually want more autonomy. They want more abilities to fire the coaches, and they won't want any kind of bureaucratic or checks and balance system in the front office. But I think there's this kind of cognitive dissonance between what someone like Mark Cuban or maybe Joe Lacob would want to do versus what the fans would want to do. And I think things that the majority owners may not necessarily care too much, or they might send to someone 3 or 4 levels beneath them to decide, would mean the world to fans. It would make their entire year to participate in some of those decisions. So when you think about every year the NBA releases those City Edition jerseys, right? I'm sure there's finalists for them. They probably pick between 2 or 3. Owners may not care. They may have a preference, but really at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. But giving some of those things up to the fans to decide and feel like they're a part of the organization is actually a massive step forward. And so I think going down the checklist, I think we have to be kind of thoughtful in what those things are. But like I was mentioning earlier, I think there's probably some low risk on the front office side, but high impact on the fan side, where you kind of explore what those things are. And so we're actually having some interesting conversations on what those things might be. And we definitely want to, if we were to get on the cap table tomorrow, I think we kind of have this inside out approach where we would start with the local fans, start with the local community, and then kind of work our way out to maybe more this digitally native team. And so we try to think about what those things, what do people want to do, what gets them excited. The list is probably really long, but we're still kind of determining what those things are.
One thing to add on your specific example is, I do think there's a world where like V1 of this is sort of giving the operating principles to someone like Morey. And I think someone like Daryl Morey is probably not interested to work for a DAO ownership group, just given, how I think strong his opinion on general management is. There's other GMs out there that certainly could benefit from that structure. So, it's also important to think about each sort of team's strengths and weaknesses. But I think giving the fans a voice and saying like, hey, we're tired of Ben Simmons' situation. We want him out of here. Daryl, figure it out. I think is a sufficient way to kind of step into a V1 where you're kind of getting into a binding sort of directive. And that might be, if you think about a traditional owner, that traditional owner might go to Daryl and say, hey man, I'm tired of this Ben Simmons stuff. Like you got to figure out a way to get rid of him. And that's the exact same way that a DAO could interact with someone like Morey. Now Morey can figure out the timing of it. He can figure out a lot of the details, but I think giving fans that voice and saying like, we're done with Simmons, Daryl figure it out. Like that's actually not all that different than how a real owner would deal with it, right? Because he's going to let him figure out the X's and O's and who and how he's going to go do it. But he's saying your directive generally. And if Daryl comes back to him and says, no man, we're keeping Ben Simmons, Daryl's probably either going to get fired or the owner has to figure out that situation, right? But they have leverage over the owner given that they're their employer. So I think a DAO can step in the V1 and sort of operate at a kind of high level. Do we keep Ben Simmons? Do we not? I think of Aaron Rodgers. Like we go all in on Aaron Rodgers or we trade him. These type of decisions. And then to Flex's point, there's stuff lower in the organization as well that we can inject. So it's sort of experimenting and slowly kind of figuring out the ways. The last part I'll say, I'm a little bit on one here, but the V2, 3, 4, 5 is you actually start to tease out who has talent within the community. So just because you have ownership doesn't mean that you have to have governance. And I think crypto gives the ability for us to decouple those two things. And so what we're envisioning a world is where we build out a series of games and sort of events and whatever we can do to tease out who has talent in these, and you can increase the voice of them. So it's just like, just because you own 5 times as much as I do doesn't mean we have to give you 5 times as much say, because I can earn my way through reputation to say I have clever ideas on how to run this league or this particular team. So I think that we have to also stop thinking about the way that we think about ownership and governance being coupled. We have an opportunity to do a playground with a decoupled version of that.
I love that. And I like that you mentioned this idea of experimenting, and you mentioned these other tangential efforts to buy a professional sports team that's not necessarily in the NBA. So I'm curious, what have you learned from exploring buying an international team first? And also, what are your thoughts on something affiliated with the NBA, like the WNBA or a G League team?
Yeah, we're super interested in WNBA and G League. I think there's a lot of validity of understanding and interacting with the league in both of those leagues. Sorry, the NBA broadly, and then I think interacting with those leagues specifically, there's a lot of leverage in there where the NBA is looking to be more experimental and be more aggressive with some of that with that process and building that business. With that being said, it is still it's a pretty stable business, so I think the experimentation space is still relatively limited as compared to some of these international teams. I think the biggest takeaway that I've bumped into is a lot of these international leagues and teams, the whole business model of the ownership structure is really often like a backdoor into promoting your business. And so, like a local casino owner buys the local basketball team, and then everything is branded the casino, and he's just using that as a marketing vehicle to push people back to the casino. You're like, oh, that's a very different professional basketball model. So one of the things that we have to be really thoughtful of is like what leagues, have legitimacy that build out that credibility. And then also, how do we do that in an economical way so that we're not just going in and signing up for an operational loss year after year as we kind of go through this experimentation. So I think that I've been very surprised on how many owners and leagues have been thinking and understanding the NFTs and DAOs and trying to wrap their head around, but they've really struggled in implementation. And so I think that plus the sort of the once you step a tier down from the NBA, it gets really strange with the business models. So those are probably the 2 biggest takeaways that I've noticed.
Awesome. Appreciate it. I want to move a little bit to the crowdfund that you all leveraged a few months ago. You used this NFT crowdfund again on Mirror and raised 1,000 ETH to help fund Krause House operations en route to buying a team eventually. So can you speak to what kind of projects those funds are for and how you think about getting work done generally within the DAO?
Yeah, so a lot of exciting stuff going on. Right now, in my head, I think I kind of refer to this as the filtering phase, right? There's been so much talent that has come into the community and so many bright minds. And so we've kind of, through conversation and identifying some early contributors and seeing these people kind of form their teams, it's been really interesting to see what we should go tackle. Some of the stuff is a little bit more intuitive, like maybe getting in touch with different NBA players and former players and launching either player-specific DAOs or player NFTs. We talked about decentralized sports operations. We've talked about the international exploration, another great team that we have in Krause House that's doing a lot of research on some of the viability of these leagues around the world. Like, are they FIBA certified? Do they have a good commissioner? We're doing kind of our due diligence on some potential overseas plays. Other ones may not be as intuitive. We've had some really interesting conversations around a potential agency model. So just for example, something that's more tangential. I've had a conversation with a lot of players, both current players and some top recruits coming out of high school. And it's this kind of interesting how they think about leveraging agents and using contracts. And they're kind of like, I kind of devote my whole life to basketball, and then I sign with an agent and they take 4% just because they know how to read a contract and I don't. And we're seeing the rise of this creator economy where kids that are 16, 17, 18 years old are looking at their friends starting Twitch streams and podcasts and launching Shopify stores, right? And in a very weird way, despite being the best in the world for their age at the game of basketball, they kind of almost get a sense that they're being left behind because their friends are doing all this stuff online and really growing their following. But they feel like the mentality is that if I dedicate my life to basketball, then eventually all that stuff will catch up. And so one of the interesting kind of emergent opportunities that we've been exploring was, well, what if they didn't have to choose? What if you kind of disrupted this agency model where you took 0% from their contract, right? But you had a community of people to help design their merch and launch their Shopify store, spin up their podcast and edit it, spin up their YouTube channel and edit it, stake part of their contract to a DeFi protocol, launch their NFTs, and do all these things that everyone's doing. And everyone's like, wow, that's really interesting, because that's additional found income that they feel that they don't have access to because they are so focused on basketball. And so that's one of these kind of emergent ideas that have come across. And I mean, we're spanning across. What's interesting about Krause House, right, is that obviously the mission is very clear and direct, but the people that we've been able to track early on, the emergent opportunities have been not just focused on basketball, but anything at the intersection of Web3 and sports. And I kind of use that as a spectrum, like people kind of ideating around open source software and DAO tooling, which has nothing to do with sports. And then possibly some media angles that are more sports heavy and less Web3. So it's not just purely at the intersection, it's across the spectrum of all these kind of ideas that have been bubbling up, which has been really cool to see.
One thing I want to touch on the crowdfund, and then I'm going to come back to some of those ideas you just mentioned, Flex. The artwork that you chose to use were these really cool kind of retro ticket models. And I think for the person who's maybe uninitiated into Web3, they see these tickets and they might think like, oh, like if I buy this NFT, it will get me a season pass to Krause House Stadium at whatever future team you might hold. So would that be an accurate assumption from this person or not? Or is it somewhere in the middle? What is the function of holding the NFT and also the governance token Krause?
Yeah, so the ticket is not a future promise of a season ticket or something like that into a potential team. It's worth probably noting on kind of our general structure here is that the ticket is an NFT into the Krause House, which is a social DAO of people who share this mission of owning and operating an NBA team and winning a championship. So we talked about that kind of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. The phase 2 is all the different credibility experimentations that we're doing. So it's really this ability to come into our Discord and participate in that journey of all these different projects that were going on. And so that's kind of the function of the NFT. Those NFTs also came with governance tokens. Those governance tokens are used to vote on our proposals with snapshots. So that might be saying, hey, we want to spin up this project, or we want to redesign the logo, and it's going to cost X amount of dollars, like whatever it may be. And so just really the governance process of the DAO. So that's really, the NFT serves as access, and then the tokens serve as governance, and those two things are split. Friends with benefits is sort of notorious of, they've kind of merged those two ideas, right? You have to have X amount of friends with benefits tokens to get into their social DAO. So those two ideas are connected, ours are split. So that's the kind of the main thing. It is worth noting, though, we are continually thinking about what are the different experiences we can do for our NFT holders. I think that, thus far we haven't been able to do a ton out of the gate for them. But as the project gets bigger and bigger and we're starting to do more of these interesting things, I think there's more opportunities to use those NFTs as access to increasingly interesting things. So I think that that's the best way to kind of think about that. Though I want to touch on one thing about the structure of Krause House is that Krause House, the reason we have to kind of exist as a social DAO, I kind of think about it as like the Virgin brand and it's kind of this umbrella organization, is that each one of the ownership opportunities are going to have very specific restrictions and requirements from the league that we do a deal with, right? So if we would do a deal with the NBL, as an example, they might say, hey, we love this idea, but we only want 1,000 people to be, sort of in this DAO for us to be able to, we don't want to have 1 million people. We're just like, we're too nervous about that. We want everyone to be KYC'd. We want everyone to be Australian, right? Like whatever their restrictions are. That is all of a sudden putting yourself like, now what is like Krause House? Like, how do we exist into that structure? So our strategy is that would spin out as a specific sub-DAO from Krause House. So, obviously Krause House members would probably get early access and early kind of whitelisting opportunity to be in that actual opportunity. But that would exist probably as a sub-DAO that ideally has a token swap back to Krause House, but that's still, TBD to be figured out with our legal team and whatnot. But that's the general strategy. And so it also gives you the opportunity if we, let's say, do a partnership with the NBL and the WNBA and the G League and the minority position of the NBA. Some people might say, hey, like, I'm not interested in, NBL because it's halfway around the world. I could never watch the game. So I don't want any of the capital. Like, great. Like, that's fine. There's a different sub-DAO opportunity for you to be involved with. So that's the general structure of Krause House.
I think that's really helpful. Thanks, Commodore, for sharing. Going back, Flex, to what you said about the different projects that the 1,000 ETH, which today is about $3.1 million is funding. One that I find particularly interesting, and this ties back to the locally minded framework that you both referenced earlier, is this idea that New Orleans is a team that who knows might sell soon, like could be available, who really knows. But we're starting to lay the groundwork for feeling out the community, getting some proof of credibility that we actually care about the local area. And a lot of that is, I think, centered on building courts. So could you help our audience understand how you think about a potential bid on a team like the Pelicans and how you go about that politically before you would actually ever go bid that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the NOLA Grassroots Project is spearheaded by one of our stewards known as Glad Robot. And essentially, the concept is, hey, let's go down to New Orleans, take some courts that could use renovations. In fact, I think some probably haven't been touched since Katrina, if I remember hearing that correctly. So some of them are in bad shape. Let's renovate those courts. Let's partner with local artists in the community to paint those courts once they're renovated, and then mint kind of the digital version of that artwork as NFTs and sell them, and then have a portion of them going to charities and back to the artists as well. And so really the strategy there is, like I alluded to earlier, it's like, how do you start local in the community? So it's not just a bunch of internet kids, taking over the team and kind of weeding out the existing fans. It's like, how do you get involved with the local community, show that we can add value there, show that we support and want to uplift the city, because basketball is still very based on geographic proximity, obviously, still a analog type sport with a stadium and a community and real fans. And so how do we kind of uplift that and show that we really care? And I think that particularly does well. Gail Benson is notorious for being very philanthropic and donating a lot of money to charity and getting involved with the community. And so we know that ranks high on her list. Being able to get involved, obviously, is great. And we want to show these local communities that we can do and support them in any way possible. But even the bigger mission, right? Like we're hoping to do that wherever we go, not just cities that could potentially sell the team to us or anything like that. But I think that's our proving legitimacy and trustworthy brand as well. We have a few other ideas that we're exploring, but I think that's probably part of our core beliefs and our core mission to get involved and benefit, partnering with things like the NBA Cares, planning stuff with athlete charities. That's something that we want to do to show kind of who we are as people, and that's part of our culture. But also it kind of shows what kind of talents the community can bring to actually go and do this. And so I think it checks a lot of boxes in the sense of like supporting local community, showing that we have the skills and capability to actually go and do that, and also do things in kind of these innovative crypto native ways, and show that we actually, as Krause House, it's baked into our culture to care and support these local communities as well. It's going to be kind of the cornerstone of things that we do in the Krause House, and NOLA Grassroots is the best example right now and probably the most autonomous. And like I said, it's led by Glad Robot, one of the OG Jerrys in our community. But when you zoom out, there's a lot of opportunities to go and do something similar, not only across the country, but across the world as well.
I'm glad you mentioned culture, and I want to spend probably the next 10 minutes on culture before we close with just a quick rapid fire. And there's a lot of pieces to this. I suppose one of the pieces I find really cool about Krause House, one of the reasons why I think you'll ultimately be successful, is because you've done a great job of finding this shared language between basketball and Web3 and your mission. At Krause House, you have MVP awards for different seasons. You very clearly articulate how you trust the process. Flex, you just mentioned Jerry's, referencing Jerry Krause, referencing the individual members of the DAO. And one of the particular pieces of this, or examples of this language, that I think works well is within onboarding. So for many folks, including me, Krause is often a first entry point into Web3. So how do you use the language of draft classes and agents to help folks understand crypto native concepts?
I think one of Flex and I's superpower, which we're childhood friends for the record, and I feel like we've always, I think, sort of gotten attached to memeable words. Like I don't mean like traditional meme, but I mean like we would define something and then really get attached to that kind of shared language and that inside joke. And I think one of those things that has carried over really well into Krause House is that every time we've seen ourselves have an opportunity to do something like that, we've pushed ourselves to try to find that language and to create this sort of meme concept. And so agents and Jerry's and Krause House and the draft class and all these different components, because I think what that does, especially in a digitally native world, is it gives you a little bit of sense of camaraderie. And so that's certainly something Flex and I think have gotten a little lucky that we both naturally had that really sense of humor, really to kind of name things in fun ways and then religiously stick to those ridiculous names. And I think it's worked really well with Krause House. And so we're big believers on nailing the onboarding experience. I think it's one of the more overlooked things. As Flex and I joined the broader crypto community, you get dumped into these discords just like, what the hell is going on? And so we really didn't want that experience for a lot of our members, whether they were crypto native or not. And so I think that language piece is really important. Obviously, anytime we think of a kind of proper noun that we need to sort of name within the Krause House, we just try to find the best 90s basketball bucket of words and go for it.
Awesome. Yeah. To use that language a little bit more, in any championship team, you have a great amount of role players. Championships are often defined by these quote unquote glue guys. So how do you find folks like those? You mentioned that you've identified a few early contributors and incentivize their sustained commitment. So for example, Eli, who I met in person last week, great example. He's brilliant. He works hard. He's compassionate, thoughtful, highly analytical. So how do you identify that kind of talent? And then how do folks actually get paid? How do they make a living potentially working for something like Krause House?
Yeah, good question. I think that's kind of the beauty of onboarding, really. And I'm starting to kind of develop this thesis that onboarding maybe not be the best term for kind of the problem space. It's really kind of like, this is a mouthful, but like potential contributor experience. Onboarding could be as simple as an intro channel, but that's really not accomplishing what you want. It's really identifying talent, identifying people that are willing to contribute, and identifying people that could be really helpful to the long-term success of your community and of your mission. And so to tie this back to onboarding a bit, one thing that's been really interesting to see is that we have these kind of on-ramps that say, hey, I'm interested in contributing. I love what you're doing. I'm at a varying degree of crypto nativeness, right? I'm either brand new or, hey, I'm coming from this DeFi protocol and I heard about you guys. This is awesome. Well, it's kind of this nebulous group of people that are just kind of floating in and out of Discord. And so what we try to do to use the draft class for is anyone who's expressed any interest whatsoever, it's not only a place to meet each other, right? If you think about how like an actual draft class, right? And the people that are very least supposed to go to lottery and sometimes later second round, they all fly to New York. They have this kind of like symbolic workout together. You might be a senior at Duke. You might be a freshman at Wichita State. You might be from Serbia, right? It's people from all over the world. But they come, they meet each other, and some of them form these lifelong friendships just because they were in New York for their draft class. But at the same time, like we from a stewardship and a leadership team kind of get to identify these people that ask them questions about their background, ask them about their network. And so many times they say, hey, I'm willing to do this. I'm going to bring my friend along who can do this. And it's actually really wildly beneficial because we got to get a sense of, okay, what kind of resources do we need? What kind of headcount do we need? And we'd be able to identify those talents. So if you think about our stewardship team almost as scouts or like agents is probably the best example. And that's the one we go with. It's like, how do we find those contributors that are willing to come in and work for Krause House? And then getting paid is easy. I think this is one of the magic of DAOs, right? It's I can either put together a proposal by myself, I can find my squad, I can bring other people. We've had people link up in the Krause House simply because they were both Sixers fans, right? And so you can kind of develop these teams, put together a proposal that we have a framework for, specify your compensation, and get to work. And there's really no bounds. I think maybe we'll probably iron out some best practices, but we've seen a variety of different ways from compensation, from only Krause to a mix of USD and Krause to milestone driven to lump sum. It's across the board, which has been a really, really interesting thing to see. But yeah, it's that straightforward, which is awesome. Unlike, I think, some of the centralized world or corporate world, it's wildly different. But anyone can kind of come in and get up and running. And it's our role as stewards to make sure that people put the best proposal forth that they possibly can.
One thing I'd add around retaining contributors is it's really, to me, it's about empowering. And Phil from CavandDAO put this word in my brain, duocracy, which I think is absolutely sort of my personal kind of guiding principle. And I think that's where we've had a lot of success, is that we would do season kickoffs and season recaps. And Flex and I would really just outline what are the problems and opportunities that we're seeing within the DAO. And anyone that was interested in rolling up their sleeves and going hard after that, we wanted to put our support behind and really encourage them to do it and compensate them for that. And I think the people that showed up to the DAO earlier who really embraced that of saying like, hey, like, and onboarding is a great example. So Eli and Mario Lopez from our community, they weren't onboarding experts. They weren't, that was not their passion in life. But we had stated it as an opportunity at one of our season kickoffs. They got super excited, and we were just like, yeah, like we'll make you admins, like go crazy, like this is yours, run with it. And I think that culture has been something that has been really, we've gotten continual feedback of like, hey, I really feel empowered here that you guys will actually, like, some DAOs are actually just a centralized group of people who are masquerading as a DAO. You guys are actually like, yo, this is the vision. If you can make a compelling argument and you're responsible enough to deliver against it, like go run wild. Like let's go see where this thing takes us. And I think that energy has been a bit intoxicating for the right personalities.
We've been using this analogy. I think DAO leadership should be more like shipbuilders than captains of the ship, which is, I think, wildly different than a traditional maybe startup. The CEO is kind of looked at as the visionary, the roadmap, the recruiter, especially in the early days, right? And so if you are on a ship and your job is to set up a new settlement halfway around the world, that's your goal, and it's your responsibility to do that. How Commodore and I view it is we're guys at the port, right? Someone comes to us and say, hey, I got half a crew. I kind of know what I want to do. What do I need? And it's the leadership team to say, hey, okay, you're going to need this kind of ship. Who are you missing based on what you want to do? Here's the people that you might need. Let us build your ship, and we wish you the best. Some of those might hit an embankment and not make it, and other ones are going to sail halfway around the world and set up trade routes and live out all their wildest dreams, right? And we're okay with that. We just want to make sure that we put the most amount of people in a position of success as we possibly can. We're not here to jump on the ship and guide it. We're here to kind of give you what you need, the tools to success, and watch it set sail. And so it is a little bit of a fundamental shift in how to think about running, air quote, running an organization. But that's been our general philosophy, and that is either the type of person that comes in and says, hey, like, I have this goal, I think this would be a great idea, I have my team, let's rock. But also sometimes that's just someone has an interesting background, and we have this kind of loose, very raw idea that we're like, hey, you should try to pick this up. And again, using basketball references, right? Like, hey, show us the Mamba mentality, right? Like, just go for it, we'll give you whatever you need. And we've had a lot of success with those kind of teams. Some teams, obviously, the nature of the DAOs, they start to fall off and not really contribute. And we're totally okay with that. People have full-time jobs and families, or they're working for 5 different DAOs. But we do have several examples now of really highly efficient autonomous teams that we're proud to say we barely check in on them. And that's the beauty of what I think is the potential of DAOs, and that we've really, really adopted and leaning into. Still a ways to go. We have a lot to figure out, but we've been pleasantly surprised with the outcomes based on the structure that the leaders and the rest of the DAO have put in place.
I love that. And for the sake of time, I won't ask a follow-up. Only I'll leave a compliment, which is that in this analogy where you're the port masters and everyone's sort of helping build these ships and voting on these potential voyages, one thing that you've done particularly well is, I think, encourage some healthy dissent. In other DAOs, I've seen a lot of proposals that basically always pass, and I think Krause House, you've done a good job of decentralizing to the point where everyone feels that ownership to disagree, and to disagree thoughtfully and with good critical feedback. So kudos to that and to everything else that you just mentioned. One, just like last follow, quick fire, and then I'll let you go, Commodore, because I know you got to run. 3 quick answers for both of you. Who's your basketball GOAT? Who's your personal NBA comp? And if you could choose any team to buy, who would it be and why? Commodore, I'll let you start.
Oh man, I'm gonna be controversial here and say Giannis is the GOAT, and Flex is gonna give me shit for the rest of my life on that. So I'm just too big of a Giannis guy to. He's not the GOAT, but I'm gonna go Giannis just to be controversial. The second question is my pickup player comp. I'm probably either Mike Miller with his shoe off, or maybe J.R. Smith on the Cavaliers. Shoot from outside. I have love deep shots, but losing a lot of my agility and mobility. And so thus the Mike Miller without a shoe, maybe some boneheaded shots, thus the J.R. Smith. Third one, buying a team. I mean, I'm a Bucks guy, so I would love to buy the Bucks, but I think that's kind of too obvious. I already went with the controversial Giannis one. I actually think buying a team like the Memphis Grizzlies is just super interesting to me. They're obviously having an incredible season, and I've been saying the Memphis Grizzlies actually for years, really since the inception of this idea. But I think what's so interesting to me about the Memphis Grizzlies is specifically like John Morant as a leader and a player, but then the ability to kind of tap into the internet's home team by being able to break out of the Memphis bounds, especially given that they moved from Vancouver to Memphis. So I think there's this really interesting sort of high leverage opportunity that Krause House could inject into a team like the Memphis Grizzlies.
Love it. Flex.
I was rolling my eyes on mute and no camera for the Giannis pick, but hey, we're not here to judge. I have a strong opinion. It's LeBron. Don't at me. I could go on about this for days, but we'll leave it. It's absolutely LeBron James. Playoff comparison. Commodore calls me Gordon Hayward. I'm not feeling that. My new one is Paul George. That's kind of like slow, methodical, plays defense whenever I kind of feel like it. So yeah, that's I'm going with Paul George. Team I own. I grew up a Wizards fan. Yeah, it's been a tough life. I don't want to say that just because my team. I like Commodore's answer because I think that's where we kind of envision taking kind of a small market team and turning it into the internet's team. But for the sake of variety, so not considering the valuation, obviously, I think being the ones to revamp the Knicks, I think is really cool. I'm not a Knicks fan, but I've lived in New York for a really long time, and that city just absolutely loves that team. And I know that every year that goes by, they're just pained by the current ownership group, and they're just waiting. I haven't met a group of fans that just every year, truly in their head, thinks it's their year, and it just never is. So something about having that city kind of rise up again and making that team successful sounds cool to me. But it is realistically probably one of the smaller market teams as well. I'll steal Commodore's answer.
Love it. For what it's worth, LeBron's my GOAT. I don't think it's a debate either, Flex. So love that. My comp is Matisse Thybulle or maybe Drew Holiday on a good day. And I would love to buy the Heat. Amazing. Grew up in Peru and Guatemala, and just the Latin American diaspora's love of the Heat, I think, would access like so many interested people from that part of the world. And plus, I love Heat culture. So those are my answers. Guys, thanks so much for joining. Can't wait to hoist the Larry O'Brien trophy with you in a few years after we win the ship.
Hell yeah.
Thank you so much for joining the show, and I'll let you know when it's out.
Awesome. Jackson, this was great. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
Cheers.